Welcome back to Mr. Dreadmere. Tonight, I have 10 true scary Appalachian Creek Trail encounters. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Mr. Dreadmere, you don't walk alone. I was shouting at myself to stop when my foot was already lifting. The words stopped tearing out of my mouth too late, and then I heard it again. Sharp and clear, "Stop," coming from somewhere ahead of me along the creek, said in my own voice with my own breath pattern. And that sound froze me hard enough that my boot hovered instead of landing, and the ground where it should have come down collapsed inward like wet paper. I stood there shaking, my knee locked, staring at a hole that had not been there the last time I looked down. The earth had caved into a dark, sucking pit edged with roots and broken shale. I pulled my foot back slow, careful, and dropped to one knee, heart hammering so loud it felt like it was pushing against my ribs. I kept thinking about that echo, how it hadn't sounded like an echo at all. It hadn't faded or stretched. It had been timed wrong too. It had warned me before I warned myself. I told myself to breathe. I told myself sinkholes happened in this area. Old mine work, underground water flow, abandoned shafts. There were explanations. There had to be explanations. I crawled back a few feet and sat with my back against a tree, hands shaking as I fumbled for my canteen. When I drank, water slopped onto my shirt because my grip wouldn't steady. I was alone out there, supposed to be. The state had sent me to walk an old creek trail that had been taken off the books years earlier. Map what was left. Confirm whether it could be reopened for controlled access. Easy job, they said. A day or two of walking, marking, taking notes. I had done this kind of work before. I knew how to trust my footing. I knew how to listen to the land. What I didn't know was how to listen to myself coming from somewhere else. After a while, my pulse slowed enough that I could think again. I leaned forward and poked at the edge of the hole with my measuring rod. The ground crumbled away further, revealing a steep drop choked with loose soil and rock. If I had stepped there, I would have gone straight down. How far, I couldn't tell. Far enough to break something. Far enough to trap me, maybe worse. I stood up and took a long look around. The creek was only a few yards to my right, moving steady and low, nothing dramatic about it. Trees pressed in close on both sides of the trail, making the path narrow. Sound carried strangely in places like this. I knew that. Water rock bends in the land. Still, I kept replaying the moment in my head. I hadn't shouted first. I had heard it before I spoke. I laughed once, short and shaky, just to hear something normal come out of my mouth. "Get it together," I said, and my voice sounded right this time. No answer came back. I marked the sinkhole location, flagged it bright, and took a wide detour around. Every step after that felt heavier. I found myself pausing before moving, listening hard, waiting for something I couldn't name. My own breathing sounded too loud. My boots on gravel sounded like footsteps that didn't match my rhythm. About 20 minutes later, I reached a bend where the trail dipped closer to the creek. The ground there was darker, softer. I slowed, testing each step. I remember thinking about lunch, about how stupid it was to let one close call get under my skin. "Watch your footing," I muttered, mostly out of habit. "Watch your footing," my voice said back from ahead of me. I stopped dead. The words had come back clean, same tone, same pace. No delay, no echo trail. It was like someone had been standing just out of sight, repeating me the instant I spoke. I swallowed and took a step back. "Hello?" I called, hating how thin my voice sounded. "Hello?" came back, again too fast, again too perfect. My skin prickled all over. I scanned the trees, the creek bank, the bend in the trail. Nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place. I told myself someone could be messing with me. A local, another surveyor, but I knew the assignment. I knew the access restrictions. No one was supposed to be out there. "Who's there?" I asked. "Who's there?" answered my own voice. My mouth went dry. I felt stupid standing there arguing with sound, but fear doesn't care about dignity. Fear just sits in your chest and waits. I took another step back, then another, keeping my eyes locked on the bend. The ground behind me felt solid, thankfully. "Stop," I said again, firm this time. "Stop" came back, and I realized with a sick twist that it wasn't copying me anymore. It was anticipating me. The word landed a fraction of a second before I finished saying it, like before. I backed away until the trail widened again. The answering stopped. No sound, no echo, just the creak and my breathing. I leaned forward, hands on my knees, trying not to panic. There had to be a rational explanation. Sound carrying backward through some weird acoustics. A delayed echo overlapping with my speech in a way my brain misinterpreted. But none of that explained how it had warned me earlier. I considered turning back, marking the trail unsafe and calling it a day. But pride is a stubborn thing, and so is curiosity. I told myself I could handle it. I told myself if it happened again, I'd leave. I moved on, slower now, marking as I went. The trail climbed slightly, then dropped again. My nerves stayed tight, every muscle ready to jump. When I spoke to myself, I kept it minimal, just breath and thought. About an hour later, I came to another soft stretch. I tested it with the rod. Solid. I stepped carefully. Left, my voice said from ahead. I froze. The word wasn't something I had been about to say. It wasn't something I had said at all. It was a direction. My heart started pounding again, hard enough that it made me dizzy. I looked down, where I was about to put my weight. The ground sagged slightly under the rod. I shifted left, just a few inches, and probed again, solid. I stepped there instead, then tested the spot I had avoided. It collapsed inward, opening another hidden pit. I backed away fast, nearly tripping over myself. "No," I whispered. "No," my voice whispered back, softer now, closer. I spun around. Nothing. Just trees, creek, trail. I felt watched, not by eyes but by something paying attention in a way that felt intimate and wrong. My own voice had always been private, something that belonged to me. Hearing it used like that felt like being touched without consent. I shouted, anger cutting through fear. "That's enough. That's enough," came back, firm, and for the first time, it sounded tired. I slumped against a tree, sliding down until I was sitting. My hands were shaking again. I pressed my palms to my face and tried to think. If this thing, whatever it was warning me, why? If it wanted me gone, why not let me fall? Why save me twice? "You want me to leave," I said quietly. "You want me to leave," my voice answered, but this time it came from behind me. I stood up so fast I nearly blacked out. I turned in a full circle, scanning. Still nothing. My skin crawled. I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool shade. "I'm going," I said. "I'm turning back." Silence. I took a step back the way I had come. The ground held. Another step, still fine. Relief washed through me, thin but real. "Careful," my voice said, gentle now, right in front of me. I stopped. "What happens if I don't listen?" I asked, surprising myself. For a long moment, there was nothing but the creak. "Then you fall," my voice said finally, flat and honest. I stood there, staring at the empty trail. "Why help me?" The answer came slower this time, as if choosing words. "Because I didn't." Cold spread through my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I didn't," my voice said again, and I heard something underneath it now, something strained. "I didn't listen." Images flickered in my mind without invitation. A misstep, a collapse, darkness rushing up, panic, pain. I shook my head hard. trying to clear it. "You're me," I said. "I was," my voice answered. I felt sick. "Win, 1980, it said, and I realized with a jolt that it had used the year without me saying it. I thought about the assignment paperwork, about how this trail had been closed quietly, without much explanation. Unsafe conditions, they'd said. No fatalities listed, but records get cleaned up, files get simplified. "You died here," I whispered. "I fell here," my voice corrected. The creek kept me. I looked toward the water, suddenly seeing it differently. Not threatening, just patient. Always moving, always there. "Why now?" I asked. "Because you came back," my voice said. "Because you're listening." My legs felt weak. I leaned on the rod, grounding myself in its solid weight. "What do you want?" "For you to leave," it said. "And tell them." "Tell them what?" "That," it answers back. I let out a shaky laugh. "They won't believe me." "Then don't tell them about me," my voice said. "Tell them about the ground, the water, the way the trail lies." "You could have warned others," I said. "I tried," it answered, and there was a sadness there that cut deep. They didn't hear themselves. I thought about all the times I had pushed through doubts, ignored instincts, trusted paper over feeling. I thought about how close I had come to repeating the same mistake. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "So was I," my voice replied. I turned around and walked back the way I came, slow and careful, testing every step. The voice guided me a few more times, always just before I needed it. Left, stop, wait. Each warning saved me from something I couldn't see. When I reached the point where the trail widened and the answering had first stopped, I paused. "What happens to you when I leave?" I asked. There was a long silence. Then, "I stay," my voice said, but lighter. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I made it out without another incident. When I reached my truck, my hands were steady for the first time all day. I sat there for a while before turning the key, just breathing. The report I filed was careful, technical. I detailed unstable ground, multiple sinkholes, unpredictable subsurface erosion. I recommended permanent closure. I didn't mention voices. The trail was never reopened. Sometimes, when I'm alone and about to do something risky without thinking it through, I hear myself say stop, just before I move. And every time, I listen. I was already halfway through my run when my breath settled into that steady rhythm, and my mind went quiet. The gravel crunching under my shoes, the only thing I was really aware of. And then I noticed the extra set of footprints beside mine and nearly tripped over myself trying to stop. I bent forward with my hands on my knees, staring down at the ground like it might rearrange itself if I looked long enough. My shoes were adult-sized, worn running shoes, leaving long, narrow prints. Next to them, perfectly aligned, were smaller prints, rounded at the toes, shallow but clear, like a child's sneakers pressed into wet mud. Except the trail was dry. It had been dry for days. I straightened slowly, heart already ticking up, and turned in a slow circle. The creek ran a few yards off to my right, shallow and fast, but there was no one else on the trail. No voices, no movement. Just me and those prints. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had walked there earlier when it was wet, and my brain was filling in gaps. I took a step forward. The small print appeared again, right beside mine, same stride length, same spacing. I stopped. It stopped. I moved my foot back. The smaller print shifted back with me. "Okay," I whispered, feeling stupid as soon as the word left my mouth. I crouched and touched the ground, dry, dusty, even, with just a thin dark layer where the trail dipped closer to the creek. There was no way fresh prints should be showing like that. My skin prickled. That crawling feeling between the shoulders that makes you want to look behind you, even when you know there's nothing there. I stood up and looked ahead, then back the way I'd come. The trail behind me showed only my own prints, fading quickly where the ground was harder. The child-sized ones only existed next to me, starting and stopping with my movements like a shadow that had weight. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. No answer. I laughed once, sharp and nervous, and started jogging again. Movement felt safer than standing still. For a few steps, I forced myself not to look down. When I did, the prints were still there, keeping pace. My breathing changed without me meaning it to, shorter, faster. I slowed to a walk. The prints slowed. I stopped. They stopped. "This isn't funny," I said, feeling ridiculous talking to the dirt. Nothing happened. No reply, no movement. Just those small, silent shapes pressed into the trail beside my own. I thought about kids from town, about how sometimes families let them run wild out here. But that didn't explain how they'd appeared without sound, or why I hadn't seen anyone when I first noticed them. It didn't explain how dry ground was holding wet impressions. I knelt again and measured one with my fingers. It was too small for an older kid, too wide for a toddler. The depth was wrong too, shallow, like someone light had stepped there. I pulled my hand back and wiped it on my shorts, even though there was no mud on my skin. I stood up fast, suddenly cold. "I'm leaving," I said, more to myself than anything else. I turned around and headed back toward where I'd parked, my eyes flicking down despite my effort not to. The prints stayed with me, faithful as a dog. My thoughts started racing, filling the quiet with worst-case explanations. Someone following me, some trick of my vision, stress, lack of sleep. I told myself I'd been pushing my runs harder lately, that maybe I was just tired. The trail curved gently, bringing me closer to the creek. The sound of the water got louder, rougher. I knew this stretch well. The bank dropped sharply there, the current faster where it narrowed between rocks. I slowed automatically. The small prints slowed too. I stopped and stared at them, then at the creek. "You can't cross there," I muttered without thinking. The water moved too fast, too deep in spots for a child. I took another step. The prints took another step. They angled slightly toward the water. "No," I said louder now. "Don't." I don't know why I said that, or who I was talking to, but fear had tipped into something else, something protective and sickening. I imagined a child stepping into that water, slipping, being pulled under before anyone could help. I stopped moving. The prints stopped, inches from the edge of the bank. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I looked up and down the creek, scanning for movement, for color, for anything out of place. There was nothing, just water and stone and the low branches hanging over the bank. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice barely above the water's roar. The prints didn't answer. They just sat there, pressed into the dirt, waiting. I took a careful step away from the creek. The prints followed, matching me exactly. I stepped back toward it. They edged closer again. Understanding crept in slowly, heavy and unwelcome. These prints weren't leading. They were reacting, following me but also guiding me, stopping me when I got too close to the water. "Did you fall in?" I whispered. My throat tightened around the words. I felt foolish, standing there inventing stories for marks in the dirt. But my gut twisted like it recognized something my brain didn't want to accept. I stepped back again, farther this time, putting space between myself and the creek. The prints followed, but there was a hesitation now, the spacing slightly off, like uncertainty. "I won't go in," I said. "Okay, I won't." I stood still, heart hammering, waiting. Slowly, the small prints faded, not erased, just softening. like they were sinking back into the ground. Within seconds, they were gone. I sagged with relief so sharp it made my knees weak. I laughed, breathless and shaky, and wiped my face with my sleeve. "I'm losing it," I told myself. "That's all." I turned and started back again, determined not to look down anymore. I made it maybe 50 steps before I heard the splash. I spun around. The creek surface rippled violently near the narrow point, water churning like something heavy had just broken through. I ran to the edge despite myself, heart in my throat, scanning the water. Nothing surfaced. I stood there panting, listening to the rush of the current, my mind replaying the sound over and over. Too big for a fish, too deliberate for a falling branch. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. When I looked down again, the small footprints were back, leading away from the water this time, angling toward the trail behind me. I swallowed hard. "You want me to go?" I said. The prints didn't move, but something about them felt urgent now, the spacing uneven, rushed. I didn't argue. I followed, stepping where they stepped, my eyes locked on the ground. The farther I got from the creek, the lighter my chest felt, like pressure easing. When the trail widened and the ground grew harder, the prints faded again, this time for good. I stood there for a long time, breathing, listening, trying to convince myself I hadn't just lost my mind in the woods. Eventually, I turned and jogged the rest of the way back to my car, not stopping, not looking down. I didn't run that trail again for weeks. When I finally did, curiosity won out over fear. I went back in the afternoon, with people around, with noise and daylight and reassurance. I watched the ground carefully. Near the creek, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small, weathered sneaker wedged between rocks on the bank, half hidden by leaves. Old, faded, too small. I reported it. They found more things after that. Old clothing downstream caught in roots. No remains, but enough to open a case. A local woman came forward eventually, quiet and hollow-eyed. She talked about her son, about a morning years ago when he'd gone missing near the creek while she was inside getting breakfast ready. She said she'd always thought he'd wandered off, gotten lost. They told her about the water. The trail was closed for a while after that. Fences went up near the narrow crossing. Warning signs followed. I still run, but I don't go near that stretch anymore. Sometimes, when the ground is just damp enough to hold a print, I look down and half expect to see those small shapes beside mine again. I never do. But every time I pass a creek, I slow down without thinking, and I listen, and I stay back from the edge, just in case someone is still trying to keep me safe. I was crouched at the edge of the creek with my shoes half off, poking at the water with a stick, when I heard someone say my full name, like they had been standing behind me the whole time, clear and certain, first and last together, the way only adults ever said it. I jumped and spun around, my heart banging hard enough to hurt, but there was no one there, just the narrow trail behind me and the trees leaning in close. I told myself it had to be my mom calling from the house, even though the sound had come from the other direction, deeper along the creek. "I'm down here," I yelled back, my voice cracking a little. No answer came, and for a second I felt stupid for being scared. I was 10 that summer, old enough to be out on my own as long as I stayed where I was told. The creek trail was my favorite place, full of frogs and minnows and smooth rocks that fit perfectly in your palm. I slipped my shoes back on and started walking upstream, watching the water more than the path. I heard my name again, closer this time. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. "Who's there?" A boy stepped out from behind a tree ahead of me, about my size, maybe a little smaller. He wore shorts and a faded shirt. and his hair was dark and plastered flat like he'd just been swimming. He looked at me like we already knew each other. "You're not supposed to cross," he said. I frowned. "Cross what?" He pointed with his chin toward the narrow part of the creek where the water sped up between rocks. I knew that spot. My mom had warned me about it more than once. "I wasn't going to," I said, even though I'd been thinking about it. "Who are you?" He smiled a little, like he was relieved. "You don't remember me?" I shook my head. Something about him made my stomach feel tight, but not in a way I could explain. He didn't feel dangerous. He felt worried. He said my name again, softer now. Hearing it from him made my skin prickle. "You catch frogs like this," he said, crouching and mimicking the way I'd been holding my stick. "You always miss the first one because you move too fast." I stared at him. That was true. I hadn't told anyone that. "Did my mom tell you that?" I asked. He looked confused for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I just know." I took a step back without meaning to. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "It doesn't matter." It mattered to me. My chest felt tight, like when you run too hard. "Yes, it does." He looked past me, toward the trail leading back home. "You should head back soon. It's getting late." I glanced up. The light hadn't changed. The sun still sat high enough that it felt like afternoon. "It's not late. For you it isn't," he said. That made my throat feel dry. "How do you know my name?" He sighed, like I was being difficult. "Because I've been here a long time." I didn't like that answer. "Do you live around here?" He nodded slowly. I did. I followed his gaze back to the creek. The water moved fast there, louder than the rest, churning white against stone. "You never crossed," he said again. I felt a strange urge to argue, to prove something. "I can if I want to." He shook his head hard now. "No, you really can't." Something in his voice finally scared me. Not loud fear. Not shouting or threats, just certainty. I imagined slipping on the rocks, imagined the water pulling me under. My stomach flipped. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because no one told me," he said. We stood there in silence. I noticed then that his feet were bare, planted right at the edge of the water. His toes were pale, almost gray. "Your feet are cold," I blurted. He looked down, surprised, like he hadn't thought about them in a long time. "I guess they are." I took another step back. "I should go." He nodded quickly. "Yes, go. Will I see you again?" I asked, not sure why. He smiled, sad and small. "I hope not." I turned and started walking back toward home. After a few steps, I looked over my shoulder. He was gone. I didn't run. I wanted to, but my legs felt shaky and wrong. I walked fast, keeping my eyes on the trail, half expecting him to appear again. He didn't. When I reached the yard, my mom was on the porch, arms crossed. "I told you not to go past the bend," she said. "I didn't," I said, breathless. "I swear." She studied my face. "You okay?" I nodded, even though my chest still felt tight. I didn't tell her about the boy. I didn't have words that wouldn't make it sound like a dream. That night, I dreamed of water rushing too fast to fight. I woke up with my heart pounding. Years passed. I grew up. The creek trail became something I remembered more than visited. The story stayed with me, though tucked away like a stone in my pocket. When I was older, I asked around, carefully. I mentioned a boy a long time ago. People got quiet. Eventually, someone told me about a child who had drowned there decades earlier, swept away trying to cross where the water narrowed. His name matched the one I'd heard spoken back to me that day. I never went back to that crossing. I never needed to. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't listened. I don't know how he knew my name. But I know this. I never crossed, and I'm here to tell you about it. I was standing ankle deep in the creek, trying to rinse mud off my hands, when my fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. Something rough and fibrous that tugged back when the current shifted, and the moment I felt that resistance, my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step. I froze with my hands still in the water, listening hard, convinced for a second that I'd imagined it. The creek pushed steadily against my legs, cold and insistent, and when I moved my fingers again I felt it clearly, a rope, thick and old, stretched tight beneath the surface. I pulled my hands out fast and stumbled back to the bank, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my ribs loose. I stood there staring at the spot where I'd felt it, my breath loud in my ears, my mind racing through explanations that didn't make sense. Fallen branch, fishing line, trash. None of it fit the feel of what I'd touched. I hadn't planned to wade into the creek at all. I'd been hiking the trail since early morning, enjoying the quiet, stopping now and then to mark landmarks for myself. When I reached the water, my boots were caked in mud, my hands dirty from grabbing roots on a steep section. Rinsing off seemed harmless enough. I crouched on the bank and leaned forward, squinting into the water. The surface was broken and fast-moving, hiding whatever lay beneath. I grabbed a long stick and reached in cautiously, poking where my hands had been. The stick caught, bent slightly, then slid free. "Damn it," I muttered, more annoyed than scared at that point. I pushed the stick down again, deeper this time, and felt it press against something solid that didn't move with the current. I shifted the angle, tracing along it, and realized it ran across the creek, not with it. My mouth went dry. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The trail was empty in both directions. The woods felt closer than they had a minute before, the quiet heavier. I told myself to leave it alone. Whatever it wasn't my problem. But curiosity has a way of pushing past common sense, especially when something feels wrong in a way you can't explain. I stepped back into the water, careful this time, and followed the line with the stick until it disappeared into a darker pocket near the bank. Kneeling, I reached down again, slower, and wrapped my fingers around the rope. It was thick, stiff with age, and tied in a knot that made no sense for anything natural. The fibers scraped my skin as I lifted it slightly, and when I did, something tugged back, firm and unyielding. That was when fear really set in. I let go immediately and scrambled backward, nearly slipping. I sat there on the bank, staring at the water, my mind finally catching up to what my body already knew. That rope wasn't debris. It was anchored. I stood up and backed away from the creek, wiping my wet hands on my pants, even though it didn't help the clammy feeling crawling up my arms. I paced a few steps, then stopped, then paced again. Get a grip, I told myself. I thought about old stories, about things people tied off in water. I thought about accidents and worse things done quietly in places no one watched. I pulled my pack off and dug out my camera. Document it, I told myself. Then leave. I snapped a few photos of the water, marking the spot as best I couldn't. The rope itself stayed hidden, invisible to the lens. As I was packing up, I noticed something else. On the far bank, partly concealed by brush, was a length of rope leading down into the water. Same thickness, same color. My throat tightened. I crossed the creek upstream where it was shallow, keeping well clear of the spot, and pushed through the brush. The rope was tied around the base of a tree, cinched tight, the knot old and weathered. I followed it with my eyes back into the water. It was deliberate. Whatever had been tied here had been meant to stay. I stood there a long time, wrestling with what to do. Part of me wanted to walk away, to pretend I'd never seen it. Another part knew I wouldn't sleep again if I did. I hiked out faster than I'd come in, my nerves buzzing, every sound making me jump. When I reached my truck, my hands shook as I unlocked the door. I went straight to the local sheriff's office and told them what I'd found. The deputy at the desk listened, polite but skeptical, until I showed him the photos and described the knot. His expression changed then, sharpening into something serious. They went out later that day. I didn't go with them. I didn't want to see what might be pulled from that water. A week passed before anyone contacted me again. When they did, they asked me to come in and give a formal statement. The rope had been connected to a body, a man missing for years, whose disappearance had never made it past a brief report. No search, no headlines, just a name and a last known location that happened to match the trail I'd been hiking. They told me the knot was the key. It matched one used by someone local, someone the missing man had known. Quietly, without much fuss, the case was reopened, then closed again. Resolved in a way that didn't need my involvement. I asked why no one had found him sooner. The sheriff sighed and said the creek changed over time. Water levels, shifting debris. Things get buried, things stay hidden. I went back once more months later, out of a need I couldn't explain. The rope was gone. The tree bore a scar where it had been tied, the bark raw and healing. The creek ran the same as ever. I don't hike that trail anymore. Not because I'm afraid of what I might find, but because I know now what can be hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to stumble across it by accident. Sometimes, when I rinse my hands in a stream, I think about that moment, about the way the rope tugged back, as if reminding me it was there, and I'm careful where I step after that. I was lifting my camera to catch a quick shot of a heron when the sound of the creek cut off like someone had flipped a switch. Not faded, not muffled, just gone, and the sudden silence made my hands shake hard enough that I almost dropped the lens. I froze where I stood, 1 foot forward on the narrow bend of the trail, my breath loud in my ears, waiting for the water to rush back into my awareness. It didn't. The creek was right there, moving fast enough that I could see it, but I couldn't hear a thing. I took a step back without thinking, heels scraping dirt, and the sound snapped back instantly, water rushing and bubbling like it had never stopped. I stood there blinking, my heart racing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. I stepped forward again. Silence. The absence of sound felt heavy, like pressure pushing against my eardrums. I swallowed and looked around, scanning the trees, the water, the trail ahead. Nothing looked different. No animals bolted. No wind shifted. Just me standing in a pocket where the world had gone quiet. "Okay," I whispered. My own voice sounded wrong there, too close, like it didn't have anywhere to go. I stepped back again. The creek came roaring back, almost painfully loud. I laughed once, shaky, and shook my head. "That's new," I muttered. I'd been photographing wildlife out there for weeks, moving slowly, learning the patterns of the place. That bend in the trail wasn't new to me. I'd crossed it dozens of times without anything like this happening. I stepped forward again, slower this time. The silence wrapped around me immediately, complete and absolute. I couldn't even hear my own breathing anymore. Panic flared hot and sudden in my chest. I backed out fast, stumbling, and the sound slammed back in so hard it made me flinch. I leaned against a tree, one hand pressed to my ribs, trying to calm down. I told myself it had to be some weird acoustic trick. Rocks, water flow. Maybe the bend shaped things just right. I told myself not to be dramatic. I edged forward, keeping 1 foot behind me on solid ground, and leaned into the silent spot. Half my body crossed into it. The creak sound vanished again, but I could still hear the rustle of my jacket behind me. The boundary was sharp. I pulled my foot back. Sound returned. Forward. Silence. My skin crawled. I crouched and placed my camera on the ground, stretching my arm into the quiet zone. I could see my hand. I could feel the air. But there was no sound at all, not even fabric brushing skin. I yanked my arm back like I'd been burned. I stood there for a long time, thinking about leaving, about how this was exactly the kind of thing that got people hurt when they ignored their instincts. But curiosity dug in deep. I marked the spot mentally and moved on, staying clear of it, finishing my loop with my nerves humming. Every few minutes, I caught myself listening harder than I needed to, afraid the silence would follow me. It didn't. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how clean the cutoff had been, about how wrong it felt. I went back the next morning. I told myself I just wanted to confirm it, rule out exhaustion or imagination. The trail was empty when I reached the bend. I stopped before it and listened. Normal creak sounds. I stepped forward. Silence. My stomach dropped. I stood there longer this time, forcing myself not to run. The quiet pressed in on me, and I became painfully aware of my heartbeat, slow and heavy. I took another step deeper into it. The silence didn't change. It didn't deepen or react. It just was. I crouched and set my camera on a rock inside the quiet zone, then stepped back. The creek roared again. I hit record and stepped forward. Silence. Stepped back. Sound. The playback later showed nothing unusual. The audio cut exactly where I stepped in, then returned when I stepped out. I felt cold all over. I started experimenting, careful, methodical. Each time I crossed that invisible line, the world went quiet. Each time I left it, sound came back. Then I noticed something else. The silence wasn't empty. After a while, I started to feel pressure, like standing underwater without the water. My head ached. My chest felt tight. I stepped out, gasping, and the creek rushed back like it was filling a void. I sat on the trail, shaken, and that was when I saw it. A narrow path leading off the bend, barely visible, like it had been walked just enough to exist. I followed it with my eyes. It led straight into the silent zone, and toward the creek. No, I said out loud. I packed up and left. I didn't sleep much that night. 2 days later, I went back with a local ranger. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd noticed something odd with sound. He stepped onto the bend and frowned. "That's strange," he said. "I can't hear the water." Well, relief flooded me. I wasn't alone in this. He stepped back. Ho! I watched his face change as he tested it again and again. "That ain't right," he said quietly. We followed the faint path together, stopping before the water. "This is where they found her," he said suddenly. "Who?" I asked. He hesitated. "A woman, years back. Went missing. They said she slipped crossing the creek." I stared at the water. "Here." He nodded. Sound carried funny that day. Search teams missed her calls. My chest tightened. I stepped into the silence one last time, heart pounding. I closed my eyes. For just a moment, beneath the pressure, I thought I heard something faint. Not the creek. A voice, maybe, stretched thin and distant. I stepped back out, shaking. The area was closed off a month later for erosion concerns. The trail re-rotted. I still photograph wildlife. I still listen to creeks. But I trust silence now, too. Because sometimes, when sound disappears, it's trying to tell you something you weren't meant to hear. I was lining up a shot of a heron lifting off the bank when the creek stopped making noise. Not faded or muffled, just gone. And the sudden absence hit me so hard, I thought for a split second that something was wrong with my ears. I lowered the camera slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast the sound might not come back at all. The water was still moving right in front of me. I could see it sliding over rocks, breaking into white lines where it sped up, but there was no sound attached to it anymore. My breathing felt too loud, like it didn't belong in the space. I shifted my weight back without thinking, heels scraping dirt, and the creek roared back instantly, loud enough that I flinched. I stood there frozen, heart hammering, listening to it rush and bubble like it had been doing the whole time. "That's not possible," I whispered. I stepped forward again, right onto the same bend in the trail. Silence. It wrapped around me so completely it felt like pressure, like being underwater without the water. I couldn't hear the creek. I couldn't hear the wind. I couldn't even hear my own jacket brush against my arms. I stepped back again. The sound came back. I stood there, eyes locked on the ground in front of me, my stomach twisting as my brain tried to find a reasonable explanation. Weird acoustics, a trick of attention, fatigue, anything but what it felt like, which was the world deliberately shutting up when I stood in the wrong place. I had been photographing wildlife along that stretch of trail for weeks. Early mornings, slow walks, learning where animals like to move and when. That bend wasn't new to me. I'd stood there plenty of times before. Nothing like this had ever happened. I edged forward again, slower now, testing it like you test thin ice. The silence snapped back into place the moment my foot crossed an invisible line. My chest tightened. I leaned forward and waved my hand through the air. I could see it. I could feel it. But there was still no sound, not even the faint rustle of fabric. I pulled my hand back out of the space, and the creek came roaring back like it was filling a vacuum. I laughed, short and shaky, because laughing felt better than panicking. "You're imagining it," I told myself. I stepped forward again. Silence. I stepped back. Sound. I did it 3 more times, each one sending a jolt of cold through me. The boundary didn't move. It didn't blur. It was sharp, precise, like a line drawn by something that cared very much about where I stood. I backed away fully and leaned against a tree, forcing myself to breathe normally. My hands were shaking, so I tucked them into my jacket pockets to hide it from myself. I considered packing up and leaving right then. I should have. Every instinct I had was telling me this wasn't something to poke at. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, and so is denial. I stayed on the safe side of the bend and finished taking photos, though my focus was shot. Every sound felt amplified now, every splash and rustle making me tense. When I finally left, I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting the silence to follow me. It didn't. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment over and over. The way the sound had vanished so cleanly, the way it came back like nothing had happened. It didn't behave like an illusion. It behaved like a switch. I went back the next day. I told myself I needed to rule things out. Different time, different conditions. Prove to myself that it was just a fluke. The trail was empty when I reached the bend. The creek sounded normal. I stopped just short of the spot and listened carefully. Everything sounded right. I stepped forward. The world went quiet again. My stomach dropped so hard it made me dizzy. I stood there longer this time, forcing myself not to run. The silence pressed in on me, and I became acutely aware of my heartbeat, slow and heavy, like it was the only sound left anywhere. I took another step deeper into it. The silence didn't change. It didn't react. It just held. A headache bloomed behind my eyes, dull and insistent. My chest felt tight, like the air was thicker there, harder to pull in. I stepped back out, gasping, and the creek crashed back into existence. I bent over with my hands on my knees, breathing hard. I set my camera on a rock and turned it on. Carefully, I placed it right at the edge of the silent zone, then stepped back and spoke out loud, describing what I was doing. My voice sounded normal. Then I stepped forward and kept talking. The moment I crossed into the quiet, my own voice vanished. Not muffled. Gone. I stepped back. My words came back mid-sentence, disjointed and wrong. I watched the footage right there, my hands trembling. The audio cut exactly when I stepped in. No distortion, no fade. I sat down hard on the trail. I started noticing other things after that. The air felt colder inside the silence. Not temperature wise, but in the way it pressed against my skin. The light looked the same, but somehow flatter, like depth had been taken out of it. Then I saw the path. It was faint, barely there, a subtle difference in how the ground was worn, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. A narrow track leading off the bend and toward the creek, right through the silent space. I followed it with my eyes, my heart pounding. It led straight to the water at its narrowest point. "No," I said out loud. I stood up and backed away, my legs weak. I packed my gear and left without taking another picture. I didn't sleep that night. 2 days later, I brought a local ranger back with me. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I'd noticed something strange with sound near the creek. He stepped onto the bend and frowned. "That's odd," he said. "I can't hear the water." Relief flooded me so hard my eyes burned. I wasn't imagining it. He stepped back, then forward again, testing it. "That ain't right," he muttered. We followed the faint path together, stopping short of the water. He went quiet, his expression changing as he looked around. "This is where they found her?" he said. "Found who?" I asked. He hesitated. "A woman, few years back. Went missing out here. They said she slipped trying to cross." My chest tightened. "Here," he nodded. "Search teams said sound carried strange that day. Calls didn't travel right." I stared at the creek, suddenly understanding in a way that made my knees feel weak. If someone had fallen there, if they'd stepped into that silent space, no one would have heard them scream. I stepped into the silence one last time, heart hammering. I closed my eyes. Under the pressure, beneath the headache, I felt something else. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of one, a presence where noise should have been. I stepped back out, shaking. The area was closed a month later for safety reasons. The trail was re-rotted away from the bend. Signs went up warning about unstable ground. I still photograph wildlife. I still walk trails and listen to water. But I trust silence now, because sometimes when sound disappears, it isn't empty. Sometimes it's full of everything no one ever heard. I was halfway across the creek with water pushing hard against my calves when I heard thunder roll somewhere far behind the hills, low and long. And I remember thinking I should hurry, even though the sky above me still looked clear enough to lie. The rocks under my boots were slick in that way that makes every step feel like a decision you can't undo. And I leaned forward, arms out, feeling for balance as the current pressed against my legs. I told myself it would only take another few steps, that I'd be across in a moment and back on solid ground. I made it to the far bank and climbed up, breathing harder than I should have been, laughing a little at myself as I shook water from my pants. I turned around and looked back at the crossing, mentally marking the safest route in case I needed to come back the same way. The creek didn't look dangerous then. It moved fast, sure, but it stayed between its banks, obedient and narrow. I stood there a second longer, listening, and then the rain started. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a few drops, spaced out enough that you could pretend it was nothing. I slung my pack higher on my shoulder and started down the trail on the other side, planning to pick up the pace and beat whatever weather was coming. Within minutes, the rain thickened. The sound of it on leaves grew louder, and the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I kept walking, telling myself I'd seen worse, that this was just a passing shower. Then I heard the creak again, louder than before. I stopped and turned back, my stomach tightening. The water level was already higher, pushing harder against the rocks, churning in a way it hadn't been moments earlier. I watched it for a few seconds, trying to judge how fast it was rising. "Damn," I muttered. I turned and started moving faster, my boots slipping on wet dirt. The rain came down harder now, soaking through my clothes, blurring my vision. Thunder cracked overhead, closer this time, sharp enough that it made me flinch. The trail narrowed and dipped, and I felt a flicker of unease I couldn't quite name. I had the sudden sense of being somewhere I shouldn't be, like I'd stepped past an invisible line without noticing. When I reached the next bend, I saw a sign nailed crookedly to a tree. "Trail closed." I stopped so fast I nearly fell. I stared at the sign, rain running down my face, my heart pounding. The wood was weathered, the letters faded, but still clear. It didn't look new. It looked like it had been there a long time. "That's not right," I said out loud. I'd come in this way, I would have seen it. I was sure of it. Another crack of thunder rolled overhead, closer still, and I glanced back toward the creek. The sound of it had changed, deepened, grown angrier. I didn't waste time arguing with myself. I turned and ran back toward the crossing, panic blooming hot in my chest. The rain hammered down now, the trail turning slick under my feet. When I reached the bank, my breath caught in my throat. The creek was nothing like it had been minutes earlier. The water had surged, rising fast, swallowing rocks that had been dry before. It roared now, loud enough that I had to shout just to hear myself. "No," I said, shaking my head. I stepped closer, scanning for the path I'd taken across. It was gone. The current tore through the narrow channel, brown and violent, carrying branches and debris. I stood there, rain plastering my hair to my face, my mind racing. I had crossed there minutes ago. Minutes. I looked upstream, then downstream, hoping to find another way across. But the banks dropped steeply, and the water raged everywhere I looked. Fear settled in deep and heavy. I backed away from the edge and pressed my hands into my thighs, forcing myself to breathe. "Think," I told myself. "Just think." A thunder boomed again, and the creek surged higher, water slapping against the bank where I stood. I took another step back, heart hammering. I realized then how close I'd come to being caught in it. How easily I could have been mid-crossing when the surge hit. How there would have been no fighting that current. I turned and ran back down the trail, away from the water, not caring where it led as long as it led higher. The rain made everything slick, and I slipped more than once, scraping my hands, barely catching myself. I found higher ground and huddled under a thick stand of trees, my chest heaving as I listened to the storm rage around me. The creek's roar grew louder still, filling the woods with its fury. I stayed there until the rain eased and the thunder moved on, leaving behind a heavy, dripping quiet. When I finally stood up, my legs felt weak, like they didn't quite trust the ground anymore. I made my way out slowly, carefully, following the trail until it widened and eventually led back to a gravel road. My truck was still there, mercifully untouched. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key, hands shaking as the reality of how close I'd come settled in. The next day, I called the local ranger station. I told them where I'd been, asked about the trail. There was a pause on the line, long enough that my stomach twisted. "That trail's been closed for years," the man said finally. "Years?" I repeated. "Officially, yes," he said. "After a series of flash floods, people got caught out there. Some didn't make it." My throat went dry. "The crossing I used, Shouldn't be passable. He cut in. Hasn't been safe in a long time. I told him about the sign I'd seen, about how I hadn't noticed it on the way in. He sighed. Signs wash away. People ignore them. Sometimes they don't get replaced fast enough. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the wall as the weight of it all settled on me. I'd crossed that creek minutes before it turned lethal. I'd stood exactly where others had likely stood, thinking they had time, thinking it would be fine. I went back once, weeks later, from a safe overlook. The crossing was gone entirely, the trail swallowed by erosion and debris. There was no question about it now. No one could cross there. I don't hike that area anymore. Not because I'm afraid of rain, but because I learned something I can't unlearn. Sometimes you don't realize you've walked into a closed place until it tries to kill you. I was halfway across the narrow footbridge when I saw the marker nailed to the tree ahead of me, pale wood catching my eye, where there hadn't been anything the day before, and I remember slowing down because my first thought wasn't fear. It was annoyance that someone had put up a sign without permission. I stepped off the bridge and walked straight toward it, boots crunching on gravel, already rehearsing the complaint I'd probably make later to the trail office. The marker was clean, too clean. The wood unweathered and the nail bright, like it had been placed there overnight. When I got close enough to read it, I frowned. There was no trail name, no arrows, no warnings, just 3 lines burned into the wood, dark and deliberate, each one a date written in full words. I stood there staring at them, reading them again and again, my brain lagging behind what my eyes were taking in. The first date matched the year a college student went missing on these trails. The second belonged to an older woman who never came back from a solo hike. The third was newer, too new. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. I leaned in closer, running my fingers along the grooves. They weren't carved with a knife. They looked burned, precise and steady, like someone had taken their time. "This is messed up," I whispered. I glanced up and down the trail, half expecting someone to step out and laugh, to tell me it was some kind of memorial or prank. The woods stayed still. The creek nearby moved steadily, its sound grounding and ordinary. I pulled out my phone and took a picture, more out of instinct than planning. As soon as I did, a knot tightened in my stomach. I didn't like the feeling of recording it, like I'd just acknowledged something that preferred not to be noticed. I finished my hike distracted, my eyes scanning every tree for another marker. I didn't see any, but the sense of being watched stayed with me all the way back to my car. That night, I looked up the dates. I already knew 2 of them by heart, but seeing them listed on missing persons pages made my chest ache. The third date didn't have a name attached yet, just a brief local report about a hiker who hadn't checked in when expected. I slept badly, dreaming of signs appearing where I walked, each one listing something I hadn't lost yet. The next morning, I drove back out there earlier than usual. I told myself I wanted to photograph the marker properly, document it before someone removed it. I parked, locked my car, and walked the trail faster than I meant to. The marker was gone. I stopped so abruptly my foot slid on loose dirt. I stared at the tree, at the pale rectangle where the bark had been scraped clean, the nail hole still visible. My heart started pounding. I stepped closer and touched the wood. It was real. It had been there. "Okay," I said out loud, forcing calm. Someone took it down. But that didn't explain why. I continued along the trail, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. When I reached the creek bend where the trail split, I saw another marker. This one was mounted lower, closer to eye level. Same pale wood, same burned lettering. different dates. My breath caught. These were older, decades old, all tied to disappearances I'd heard about growing up, the ones adults talked about in lowered voices. I felt dizzy. I hadn't heard anyone behind me, but suddenly I was aware of how alone I was. I took another picture, hands shaking now. As I straightened, I noticed something that made my stomach twist harder. The marker wasn't pointing anywhere. It faced the trail directly, like it was meant to be read by someone standing exactly where I was. I backed away slowly. The rest of that week more markers appeared. Not all at once, one at a time, always overnight, always on different sections of the trail system. Always bearing dates, never names, never directions. I started documenting them obsessively, mapping where they appeared and when. Patterns emerged whether I wanted them to or not. The markers always showed up near water, creeks, runoff channels, places where sound carried poorly. I brought it up to a ranger I knew, careful not to sound unhinged. He laughed at first, then stopped when I showed him the photos. "Those shouldn't be there," he said slowly. "They weren't yesterday," I replied. "They checked the trails." The markers were gone by the afternoon. That night, another appeared, this one closer to the parking area, this one bearing a single date. Tomorrow. I sat in my car staring at the picture on my phone, my pulse roaring in my ears. My name wasn't there. No names ever were. But I knew deep down that date wasn't random. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn I drove back out, heart racing, telling myself I just needed to remove it, to stop whatever this was. The marker stood exactly where I'd left it, fresh and pale against the dark tree. I reached for it and hesitated. Something about the wood felt wrong, like touching it would mean agreeing to something I didn't understand. I stepped back and looked around. The creek beside the trail seemed higher than usual, moving faster. Rain must have fallen upstream overnight. I thought about the disappearances, about how often people underestimated water. I pulled the marker free in one sharp motion. The nails squealed against bark, loud in the quiet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the creek surged. Water rose violently, spilling over its banks, swallowing the lower trail in seconds. I ran, slipping and scrambling uphill as the sound behind me turned into a roar. When I reached safety, gasping, I looked back. The trail where the marker had stood was gone, erased under churning brown water. The marker lay in the mud near my feet, face down. I left it there. The flood receded hours later. Damage was extensive. Officials closed sections of the trail system indefinitely. No one went missing that day. The markers never appeared again. I still hike, but not there. And every time I pass a new sign, I stop and read it carefully, grateful when it tells me something simple, something meant to help. Because I learned the hard way that some warnings don't use names, and some markers aren't meant to guide you forward at all. I was halfway down the slope when my foot slid on loose gravel and my weight went wrong, my body twisting before my brain caught up. And then there was a sharp crack in my ankle that made the world narrow to pain and breath, and the sound of my own shout tearing out of me. I hit the ground hard on my side, knocking the air out of my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't do anything but gasp, my fingers digging into dirt and leaves while my ankle burned like someone had driven a nail straight through it. I lay there staring at the ground inches from my face, listening to my heartbeat thunder in my ears. "Idiot," I muttered once I could breathe again. I tried to sit up, and the pain flared so bright it made my vision blur. I gritted my teeth and waited it out, sweat breaking out along my spine. I had twisted that ankle before years earlier, and this felt worse, deeper, wrong. I was alone out there, same as I'd planned. The Jellicoe paths weren't heavily used, especially not on weekdays, and I'd liked that about them. quiet, simple. A place where you could hear yourself think. I shifted carefully until I was sitting, my back against a tree, and tested my leg. The ankle wouldn't take weight. Even the smallest movement sent a hot pulse up my calf. "Great," I said out loud, my voice echoing faintly off the slope. I dug my hand into my pack and pulled out my water, taking a long drink and forcing myself to slow down. Panic wouldn't help. I wasn't far from the creek that ran along the lower trail. If I could get there, I could follow it back toward the main path. I just had to move carefully. I stood up using the tree for support and nearly blacked out when my bad foot touched the ground. I sucked in a sharp breath and leaned harder into the trunk, waiting for the pain to settle enough to think again. That was stupid. I told myself, calmer now. I started down, slow and awkward, favoring the injured leg, using branches and rocks to steady myself. Every step took concentration. Sweat soaked my shirt, not from heat, but from the effort of not falling again. When I finally reached the creek, I collapsed onto a flat rock at the edge and let myself breathe. The water moved steadily past, shallow but fast in places, its sound filling the space around me. It was comforting, familiar. "Okay," I said, talking through it like I always did when things went sideways. "You follow the water. You take your time. You'll be fine." I stood again and started downstream, keeping the creek on my right. The path was uneven, but flatter than the slope I'd come down. My ankle throbbed with every step, but it was manageable if I stayed slow. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I heard my name. It came from downstream, carried on the sound of the water, clear enough that I stopped without thinking. "Hello," I called back, my voice echoing thinly. For a moment, there was nothing but the creek. I felt a flicker of embarrassment. Sound traveled weird out here. It always had. Then I heard it again. "Hey," my voice said. My stomach tightened. The tone was off. Flat, like someone mimicking me without quite understanding how I spoke. "That's not funny," I called, scanning the trees and the bends in the creek. "Over here," my voice said again, closer this time. My skin prickled. I knew the sound of my own voice. I'd spent my whole life inside it. Hearing it come from somewhere else felt wrong, in a way I couldn't explain. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The creek kept moving. Birds chirped somewhere high above. Nothing else stirred. "Who is that?" I asked, hating the edge creeping into my words. There was a pause, just long enough to make my chest feel tight. "It's me," my voice answered. I laughed sharp and brittle. "Yeah, no," I said. Not buying that, I took a step forward, then stopped. My ankle screamed in protest, and I leaned on my walking stick, heart pounding harder now. "Help," my voice said from downstream, strained this time. The word hit me in the gut. I'd yelled that earlier when I fell, raw and instinctive. Hearing it again, twisted and distant, made my mouth go dry. I looked down at the creek, then back up the trail behind me. Logic fought with fear in my head. Someone else could be hurt. Someone else could sound like me enough to fool my ears, especially with the water and the distance. "You hurt," I called. "Yes," my voice said immediately. "Bad," I swallowed. "Where are you?" "Down here," it answered. "Be the water." That wasn't helpful. I glanced at my ankle, already swelling inside my boot. Going farther downstream meant more uneven ground, more chances to fall, but leaving someone injured out there felt impossible. "Stay where you are," I said. "I'm coming." "Okay," my voice replied, and for the first time it sounded relieved. I started moving again, slower than before. My focus split between the pain and the sound ahead of me. Every few steps I called out, and every time, my own voice answered back, guiding me. "Left," it said once, just before the bank dropped sharply. I stopped short, my heart jumping. I hadn't seen that drop until I was right on top of it. "Thanks," I muttered, shaken. "Careful," my voice replied. As I moved, unease settled deeper in my chest. The voice always answered too fast. It didn't echo the way mine did when I shouted into open space. It just appeared, clean and close, like it was standing just around the bend. "How did you get hurt?" I asked. There was a hesitation this time, a subtle one, but I felt it. "I fell," my voice said, "slipped." "Where?" "Up there," it said, vaguely. "That's where I fell," I said before I could stop myself. Silence followed. The creek rushed on. I stopped walking. My pulse thudded in my ears. "That's where I fell," I repeated, slower now. "I know," my voice said softly. Cold crept up my spine. "How do you know that?" "You told me," it replied. "No, I didn't," I said. "I didn't tell anyone." Another pause, longer this time. "You will," my voice said finally. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the stick tighter. "I'm not moving," I said. "You come to me." There was a strange sound then, not quite laughter, not quite water. "I can't," my voice said. "I'm stuck." "Where?" "Down here," it repeated. I took a step back, my instincts finally screaming loud enough to cut through everything else. "I'm going back," I said. "No," my voice snapped, sharp now. "Don't." That did it. I turned around and started back the way I'd come, pain be damned. Every step felt like fire, but fear pushed me harder than pain ever could. "Wet?" my voice called, closer than it had been before. I didn't answer. "Please," it said, and the words sounded so much like something I would say that my throat tightened. I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell again, and the creek noise seemed to swell, drowning out everything else. "Help!" my voice screamed. I stopped, chest heaving. The word echoed around me, bouncing off rock and water and trees, and suddenly I couldn't tell which sound belonged to me and which didn't. I turned slowly. The creek bent ahead of me, water rushing hard around a cluster of rocks. I could see something there now, something dark and low, half submerged near the bank. It looked like a man crouched in the water. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "Don't move." The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, head bowed, water sliding around its shoulders. "I'm here," my voice said, coming from it. I took a step closer, then another, my ankle protesting with every movement. As I got nearer, details sharpened. The shape was wrong, too still. The clothing hung heavy and dark, soaked through. I stopped a few feet away. The man looked up. It was me. Not exactly, not perfectly, but close enough that my stomach flipped. Same hair, same jacket, same cut on the cheek I'd gotten earlier from a low branch. His eyes were open and empty, fixed on me without blinking. "This is where it ends," my voice said from his mouth. "No," I whispered. He smiled, and water poured from his lips. "This is where you stay." Something shifted behind him, the current tugging at his body, pulling it lower. I saw then that one of his legs was twisted at an impossible angle, pinned between rocks. Understanding crashed into me, heavy and sickening. This wasn't a warning, it was a replay. A version of what happened if I kept going. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm not you," I said, louder now. "Not today." The figure's face twisted, anger flashing through it. "You will be," it said. I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the next stretch. Just pain and breath and the sound of my own voice yelling for help, real this time, raw and desperate. I followed the creek until I hit the wider trail, then kept going until I collapsed in the dirt. A couple found me there hours later. They heard me calling, they said. They helped me out, got me to a hospital. My ankle was broken in 2 places. I never told them about the voice. Years later, after the pain faded and life moved on, I looked it up. Old reports. Accidents along that stretch of creek. A man injured, tried to follow the water out, got stuck and drowned not far from where I'd stopped. His name was mine. Same first, same last. I don't hike alone anymore. And when I hear my own voice calling from somewhere it shouldn't be, I don't answer. I was standing at the shallow creek, crossing with my shoes in my hands, toes curled against the cold stone, when I heard humming coming from below the water, soft and steady like someone singing to themselves. And the sound made me freeze because it didn't belong there, and because I knew, even then, that creeks didn't hum. I was 9 years old and supposed to be waiting on the bank while my uncle checked the trail ahead, and I remember feeling proud that he trusted me enough to let me stand there alone, watching the water slide over the rocks. The ford wasn't deep, just wide, with smooth stones you could step across if you were careful. I'd crossed it plenty of times before. That day felt the same as any other until the humming started, low and gentle, like a lullaby my mother used to hum when she thought I was asleep. I leaned forward without meaning to, lowering my shoes to the ground, my ears straining. The sound wasn't coming from the woods or the air. It was coming from beneath the surface, from somewhere under the moving water. My chest felt tight, not scared exactly, just confused, like my brain didn't know where to put what it was hearing. "Hello," I whispered, my voice small and thin. The humming didn't stop. It didn't change. It just kept going, steady and patient, like it hadn't noticed me at all. I stepped closer to the edge, my bare feet sinking slightly into the mud, and the cold made me suck in a breath. I knew I wasn't supposed to go into the water without my uncle, but the sound felt gentle, familiar. It reminded me of bedtime and safety and being held. I told myself maybe someone downstream was singing and the water was carrying it up. That made sense, didn't it? I took 1 step onto the first stone. The humming grew clearer. I could hear the tune then, not words, just notes rising and falling, slow and soothing. My heart started to beat faster, not from fear but from a strange pull, like the sound wanted me closer. I balanced carefully and stepped onto the next rock, the water swirling around my ankles. "Don't," a small voice in my head said, but it sounded far away. I took another step. That was when I noticed how quiet everything else had become. No birds, no insects, just the water and the humming underneath it, threading through my chest and making my head feel light. I stopped in the middle of the crossing, water rushing around my calves, and looked down. The surface reflected the sky and trees, broken by ripples, but beneath that I thought I saw something darker, a shadow where the sound was strongest. "Hey," I said, louder now. "Who's there?" The humming shifted slightly, the tune changing, and for a moment I thought it was answering me. My mouth went dry. I tried to step back, but my foot slipped on the slick stone and panic flared hot in my stomach. I windmilled my arms and caught myself, water splashing up my legs. The humming didn't stop. It felt closer now, like it was right beneath my feet. "Stop," I said, my voice shaking. I don't know who I was talking to. The creek, the sound myself. I forced myself to look away from the water and toward the bank. My uncle wasn't there yet. The trail behind me was empty. I felt very small all of a sudden, very alone in the middle of moving water. I took a careful step back toward the bank. The humming softened, like it was disappointed. Another step, and I slipped again, this time going down hard onto my hands and knees. Cold water soaked my clothes instantly, stealing my breath. The humming swelled. It was louder than the rushing water now, wrapping around my head, pressing in on my ears. I cried out, fear finally breaking through, and scrambled toward the bank, fingers clawing at wet stone. Strong hands grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the creek. I sobbed as my uncle pulled me close, his voice urgent as he asked what happened, what I was doing. It was singing. I choked. The water was singing. He went still for a moment, then tightened his grip. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was imagining things. He carried me away from the ford without another word. Later, wrapped in a blanket, I heard him talking quietly with my mother. I heard the word drownings. I heard years mentioned, spaced far apart. I heard someone say children. We never crossed there again. Years later, when I was old enough to understand, I learned about the ford, about the accidents, about how people said they hadn't heard the victims scream, about how the water always looked calm. I still remember the tune, and whenever I hear someone humming softly where they shouldn't be, I move away and don't look back.